Hello, all, and welcome to the Global Realignment Podcast, where we'll be discussing our nation's national security and geopolitical agenda. Tonight, February 27th, 2025, we'll be discussing the latest developments in the alleged rare earth deal Trump's team is forging with the Ukrainians. It's been a contentious issue, and we're going to try to dig into as many details as we can tonight. Might be a little bit of a longer show tonight, but I really appreciate everybody coming back and joining us. We're going to dive right in. Let's just say that everything surrounding this deal is guaranteeing our indefinite involvement in Ukraine for the foreseeable future, economically and militarily, in my estimation. But so far, Zelensky has said no to a deal. And I'm going back a little bit. This has been ongoing for a couple weeks now, right? The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, went over a couple weeks ago and he presented a deal to Zelensky, which he refused, largely because it was absent of any security guarantees for Ukraine. This is the most contentious issue, is the security guarantees. And Zelensky has said no to a deal for minerals and reportedly said yes again, and said no, and this is stuff that's largely flown under the radar. Zelensky has kind of been going back and forth with the U.S. for a couple weeks now regarding this mineral rights deal, largely because of the security guarantees. And the mineral rights agreement has been a major sticking point in the relationship between Kiev and Washington. At the Munich Security Conference, Zelensky refused to sign a version of the deal, and this is the first version presented to him by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent about 2 weeks ago. And this, again, like we just mentioned, is because of the security guarantee. And that has driven a tremendous amount of the friction when it comes to the negotiations. And I would predict that much of the negotiations in the future are going to be, let's say, disrupted by this question of security. The EU, for those who have been paying attention, the EU is wanting to put troops, or what they call peacekeepers, in Ukraine. And they want U.S. backing. They want a U.S. guarantee when they put those troops over there that, if something were to happen in the future after a ceasefire takes place, that the U.S. would intervene. And I guess that would include if the Russians attack the European peacekeeping forces, that the U.S. would intervene. And so that's problematic. And again, we'll be exploring some of the reasons why. There's been this question out there as to whether or not Zelensky is just trying to deliberately disrupt negotiations, any potential negotiations related to a ceasefire, and create a situation that's undesirable to all parties. And I don't think that he's necessarily trying to do that. I think that any maneuvering he's doing right now is meant to pressure the U.S. to conform to the maximalist, because Zelensky is, I would argue, more aligned with the EU perception of how security should operate in Ukraine. And so I would say that anything he's doing right now is meant to pressure the U.S. to conform to the maximalist demands that the EU has for the Russians. The EU is very insecure for many reasons that we won't get into tonight. But they oftentimes start with events, World War II and this kind of thing. Events in the Cold War. So the EU, Eastern Europe itself, uses the shadow of World War II and the Cold War to justify their insecurities when it comes to the Russians. And so they've been making the case for years now that, the Russians aren't going to stop in the Donbass, or they're not going to stop in Ukraine, and they're going to go into Lithuania, Estonia, they're going to go into Romania and all these different countries, and they're not going to do any of that stuff. But it's this paranoia. It's a narrative that needs to keep being fed. And so there, I've done some research into these prospective security arrangements that the EU is proposing. And I came across an article in Foreign Affairs that um, kind of spells out some of the options that the European Union, in conjunction with the US and Ukraine, could take. And I'm just going to briefly touch on those. And I'm not going to get into too many of the details, but you go to Foreign Policy and they have this article here, and it's by Thomas Wright, and it's called "The Right U.S. Strategy for Russia-Ukraine Negotiations." And the first proposal that Thomas Wright puts forth, and I believe that Thomas Wright actually worked in the Trump I think he worked in the Biden administration. In the final year of the Biden administration, he served as a senior director for strategic planning at the National Security Council. Prepared Ukraine for talks in 2025, regardless of who won the U.S. election in 2024. And the first proposal is NATO membership for Ukraine, which is off the table. If you've been paying attention to many of the conversations that Trump has been having with the press, that's off the table, which would provide Kiev with an Article 5 security guarantee, which is ambiguous, which, could go one way or the other if truly tested. In other words, even if there was that kind of violation, my opinion is that we probably wouldn't be getting involved one way or the other in a situation, related to Ukraine and Russia. The second that he mentions is what has been called the Israel model, with Washington providing enough military and intelligence assistance to enable Ukraine to deter and, if necessary, to defeat Russian forces without direct intervention by other nations. And that would be difficult, given that one of the requisites for even the start of negotiations by the Russians is the demilitarization of Ukraine, right? I mean, you're going to continue, and we're going to get into some of the quotes from Lavrov and Putin a little bit later, but the idea of continuing to pump military personnel and material into Ukraine after any negotiation or ceasefire seems to be a red line for the Russians, that and they wouldn't even start negotiations if that was, on the table. But we'll see. A third end state would center on a European security guarantee. U.S. President Donald Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, recently told NBC News that the matter of a security guarantee is squarely going to be on the Europeans, raising the question of whether European countries could send troops to Ukraine after the war. And this is kind of what we saw today. And, last week, Macron, the Prime Minister of France, came to the U.S. to pitch this idea of foreign advisors or foreign military personnel in Ukraine, French and British, but I would assume that there would be other countries that would be involved in this. And today, on the 27th, Keir Starmer came to Washington to basically propose the same thing. And the key to understanding much of the conversation surrounding this idea of European personnel on the ground in Ukraine is the idea that they want a U.S. guarantee, right? And that's something that Trump and the administration has been very mealy-mouthed about, and I'm sure that we'll get some clarity about that in the future. The last end state would hinge on Ukraine's neutrality, a demand that Russia is likely to begin any negotiation with, building on discussions in Istanbul in 2022. The key question will be what happens if neutrality is violated. And that was part of the negotiations in 2022 that the UK basically torpedoed right after the Russians had invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. By, I believe it was March of 2022, negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians had already started. And much of the demands that the Russians had, reasonable demands, were being met in these negotiations. But the European countries, particularly the UK and the US, torpedoed those negotiations. And it was tragic. But last Friday, the United States proposed a new draft agreement obtained by the New York Times, which still lacked security guarantees for Ukraine and indeed even tougher financial terms. And honestly, I think that much of these tough financial terms in this agreement that came out in the past Friday are just sort of, starting demands from our government. They're meant to be part of the negotiations. You start at the maximalist demands and you kind of work your way down. I don't think that the Trump administration is looking at detaching any kind of security guarantees from the issue of Ukraine. I don't think that he's looking to just completely withdraw, which would be America first, just completely withdrawing from the conflict. But I don't think that he's against the idea of providing some form of security guarantees, even if, obviously maybe not troops on the ground, nothing too blatant, but sort of a tacit backing of perhaps European so-called peacekeepers on the ground in Ukraine. The draft from last Friday reiterated a U.S. demand that Ukraine relinquish half of its revenues from natural resource extraction, including minerals, gas, and oil, as well as earnings from ports and other infrastructure, half of it. Doesn't really seem like the best deal for Ukraine. Sounds like extortion. Again, we're going to continue to get into that. Under the proposed terms, those revenues would be directed to a fund in which the United States would hold 100% financial interest, and Ukraine would contribute to the fund until it reaches $500 billion. So you can see obviously why Zelensky is pissed off, right, with this draft agreement, right? It's vague. There aren't any enforcement mechanisms. It's not well thought out. Typically, when we're talking about negotiations like this, historically, they take years to formulate, right? You have to figure out the infrastructure, who's going to manage this this fund that the Ukrainians and the U.S. is supposed to be contributing to, and these kinds of things. The sum is more than twice the value of Ukraine's economic output in 2021. This is the 500 billion number that Trump has put out there before the war. And the agreement, this particular agreement, didn't include any kind of security guarantees for Ukraine. And honestly, I don't think that any agreement has to explicitly spell this out. If we've got businesses and firms in Ukraine that are exploiting these mining endeavors, these mining opportunities, it seems obvious that we're going to have to, some form of security is going to be involved in managing these situations. So we're going to be there, regardless. If it's not as peacekeepers, if it's not our military, if it's not our military equipment, our firms and our businesses will be operating these mining interests, which is interesting. And so on Sunday, Mr. President Zelensky gave a press conference related to this particular iteration of the document that the Trump administration is trying to get Zelensky to sign. And he said that he was ready to resign as a leader if it meant it would bring peace to his country, suggesting he could swap it, which would be an agreement on this mineral situation, for NATO membership, which is, again, off the table, while also pushing back against U.S. demands for Ukraine's critical minerals and other natural resources as part of negotiations to end the war. He said, if it guarantees peace in Ukraine, if you really need me to resign, I'm ready. I can exchange it for NATO. Now he's manipulative, and so he likely doesn't mean that. He understands that there aren't any Western officials, including in the Trump administration, that's, in my opinion, going to seriously push him to resign. Now, Trump has said this kind of thing, but I think that, again, this is probably all part of the 5D chess that Trump likes to play, and just it might fit into his negotiation with Zelensky, calling him to resign, calling him a dictator, and all these different things. When he met with Keir Starmer today, he said, when a reporter asked him about his comments on Zelensky being a dictator, he says, well, did I call him that? I don't remember. And I would say, wow, okay, well, So it just kind of gives you an idea of how mealy-mouthed he can be when it comes to this kind of thing. And NATO keeps being mentioned. And I would argue that NATO is mentioned often by Zelensky, largely because he already knows that he's not going to get into NATO. It's sort of, again, part of the negotiation that he's playing on his part. He says, well, the maximalist demand is NATO. But if you've noticed, of course, and been paying attention to the trends, over the past couple of, I would say, months, we've been hearing more and more about security guarantees. So it's not formal NATO membership, whereas Russia would violate Ukraine, or what's left of Ukraine's sovereignty, and bring in Europe and the United States. It's security guarantees. Again, what kind, personnel from Europe, war material, all of these different things, building up Ukraine's military infrastructure, which we have to understand, again, goes against this red line, where the Russians are saying, well, we're not going to even start a negotiation unless there's a commitment to Ukraine's neutrality, which means demilitarization. And so that's very important to recognize, because this could be a stumbling block for Trump and his team in any negotiation, unless they think that they can do the Mike Waltz Netanyahu thing, where they could send Mike Waltz over there to Russia and just kind of strong arm them into, signing some kind of agreement or ceasefire. I don't think that that's going to be how it works. And so on Sunday, Zelensky also pushed back against Trump's demand for a $500 billion share of Ukraine's deposits of rare earths and other minerals as part of a draft deal Trump said would reflect the amount of aid the U.S. has provided to Ukraine during its war with Russia. And again, there are many conflicts about whether or not this amount that Trump is citing is accurate. And a lot of people are playing games with the numbers. I don't know that we'll ever probably understand the exact amount that was given to Ukraine. And I think that what Trump is probably doing is he might be conflating military aid with economic aid and, all these other things. I think Zelensky went on an interview the other day and he was talking about how he hasn't received more than maybe like 100 or 120 billion dollars in aid. And hey, Trump is in office and we haven't seen any kind of audits, right? And you would think that that would probably be one of the first initiatives that the administration would take up, would be auditing the aid that we're giving to Ukraine. And then, looking at the results of that, it would probably take months to do it. You wouldn't get any immediate results, but it would give us an idea of, it would probably give us a better grounding when it comes to making decisions on whether or not we should continue aid to Ukraine, right? Now, I pulled, when it comes down to this last part that I've went through, I pulled a piece from an interview from Foreign Policy by Cameron Abadi and Adam Tooze. And Adam Tooze wrote a great book years ago called The Wages of Destruction, and it's about the economy of Nazi Germany. Great book. But if you get access to this article, you'll see that Adam Tooze is certainly, very upset. He's very angry when it comes down to what the Western media is perceiving as Trump's overtures, or perhaps in their lexicon, his sort of tepid, let me see, his appeasement, his appeasement. It's being conceived as appeasement to the Russians, and he's very upset about that. But there was a crucial part in the article that relates to some of the things that we're talking about in the interview. And Cameron asks, on the most basic terms, can Ukraine afford to accept the $500 billion mineral rights deal that the Trump administration has reportedly put forward? And Tooze responds, on its face, and it's difficult to know whether to take it at face value, it is an extraordinary act of extortion. It's not unheard of for foreign creditors to want security. It's quite common, in fact. But to transform a relationship that since the beginning of the war was cast in very different terms all of a sudden, in retrospect, into this sort of hard-nosed bargain is devastating to the previous American interpretation of what this war was about. Now, that's very important. That's a very important sentence, right? Because Trump is making this very transactional, right? And when Tooze says the previous American interpretation of what this war is about, he's saying Americans didn't perceive this war as a war that was just about imperialism or about extracting Ukraine's precious minerals, right? America looked at it as defending a democracy, which Ukraine is not. America looked at it as, defending this small European country against the Soviet Russian horde that's going to be pressing across Europe in the next couple of years like Napoleon did. That's what it was always portrayed as, right? If we don't stop Putin here, he's going to be like Hitler and he's just going to keep going. And again, this is European narratives. This is European insecurity that's just blatantly out in the open, which is unfortunate. And so the interpretation Tooze is saying is going to change because now, hey, we're worried about minerals and what we can extract from Ukraine to compensate us for the cost of this war. What about our original narrative? This is going to confuse a lot of Americans, rightfully so. People need to start paying attention to that kind of thing. Tooze goes on. And then you look at the mineral deposits themselves, and this is crucial for me because it's been very interesting. And experts in mineral deposits will tell you they're all based on out-of-date Soviet geological surveys. And the minerals per se are not worth very much. They have to be developed. They have to be explored. And none of that is actually being done. So the whole thing has this ludicrous kind of cosplay. I mean, he's enacting a pantomime version of a villain, which isn't really villainous. It doesn't really add up to a substantial plan for the extraction of actual resources from Ukraine, and yet nevertheless completely demolishes and destroys the frame of legitimacy that was wrapped around Western aid for Ukraine, whilst clearly indicating the worst possible intent. This is just, it's like a clear-cut admission, right? This sentence right here. It doesn't really add up to a substantial plan for the extraction of actual resources from Ukraine. And yet, nevertheless, meaning he doesn't really have a plan to legitimately put this, extraction thing into place. Nevertheless, completely demolishes and destroys the frame of legitimacy that was wrapped around Western aid for Ukraine. And this is the crucial part of this. This narrative they've built up around Ukraine. On the one hand, I don't think that Trump is completely averse to the narrative, but he's reframing it, right? And he's making it, again, like I said earlier, more transactional. Whereas before, people like Tooze is basically saying, well, this was originally about democracy, promoting democracy against a dictator, a Soviet-era dictator like Yeltsin or Khrushchev or something like that. We're still fighting this. And in the minds of many of these people, we're still fighting that war. And so Trump is destroying the narrative I don't think it's beneficial at all, the way that he's doing it. And I think that it just kind of serves the ends of many of these crazy people that got us into the mess in the first place. But at the end of the day, he's saying, hey, we can't have people looking at this as transactional. We have to have their spirits as well, right? And he goes on to say, so it's like, if you have bad intent, you'd think you would disguise it, right? You see what I'm saying? If you were serious about economic exploitation, you'd actually have to be certain that there was something to be exploited. And then he's talking about the minerals. There's been many articles lately about, the worth and the legitimacy, the worth and how prevalent these rare earth minerals are. So ultimately, when considering the state of Ukraine even prior to the war, is a long-term investment by American firms, the American government, individual American investors, is a long-term investment in their mineral resources, a promising investment. And what's important to point out here is that it's shaky ground. You don't know at the end of the day, this is a war zone. So, how long will it be before you can actually see any kind of, how long will it be for investors, whether they be individual or firms, how long would it be before they saw a return in their investment? Now, the Ukrainian, these rare earth resources have been known, people have known about them for a long time. Ukraine themselves have tried to extract these resources. And it takes years, right? A corrupt bureaucracy in Ukraine, a lot of regulation and red tape that's involved there. How are they going to do you think that tomorrow the American firms are just going to magically, bypass all of those things and start just, getting shovels and digging out these resources? I doubt it. But, this is the kind of deal that we're signing on to, which, again, seems to be theater. Now, Trump has made it clear that he thinks the U.S. should no longer send aid to Ukraine without getting anything in return. And the key word there, the key there is understanding that it's about getting something in return. It's not that in principle Trump is averse to the idea of giving aid to Ukraine. It's that he wants something in return, this mineral deal, right? And consider statements made as recently as this past Tuesday, by Trump in the Oval Office related to the deal. The reporter asks him, what does Ukraine get out of this mineral deal? Trump's response, $350 billion and lots of equipment and military assets. And the right to fight on. Trump said, I'd end the war, stop the killing. $350 billion and lots of equipment and military equipment. And the right to fight on, and originally the right to fight. He says, look, Ukraine, I will say they are brave and they are good soldiers, but without the United States and its money and its military equipment, this war would have been over in a very short period of time. In fact, I was the one that gave the javelins in his first term. You remember the famous javelins? That was me. That wasn't Obama. That wasn't Biden. It was me. And they wiped out a lot of tanks with those javelins. That was a big deal at the time. That was the beginning when people said, wow, that's something. Now, this is a quote from Trump. And he did give them javelins. He gave them this war material when in his first term, when they were going through this civil war that started in 2014. Now, remember, what we're seeing right now is a hot war between Russia and Ukraine that Trump says Biden started. But he was providing war material to the Ukrainians going back into his first administration. What was the reason for that? Right? Was the reason that he did it because he was insecure because of the attacks that, because of Russiagate, because the media kept saying he was a puppet of Putin, like we've mentioned in other videos? Is that why he did that? But he's bragging about it right now, which I would say him providing lethal aid to Ukraine, which even, like he says, even Obama didn't do, was probably one of the issues that precipitated this conflict that we're seeing right now. Which makes me skeptical, right, in any future negotiation that Trump actually wants to stop all of this stuff from happening. Anyways, important to pay attention to what Trump says. It's mealy-mouthed, and it comes out both sides of his mouth sometimes. One day he's supporting the Russians, the next day he's supporting the Ukrainians, and, right? The only thing we can do is wait and see, honestly. We can't really cast much judgment right now because, again, he's done this kind of thing before. And aid or security will allegedly continue if the mineral deal is solidified. We must guarantee our investments in this scenario. We have investments when whether or not we're extracting anything. Again, this deal is basically a cover for some form, we don't know what it looks like yet, of security guarantee from the United States. And America First policy would be dropping this all together, right? They would have been saying, we're pulling out, Europe, you deal with this. Now, there are too many crazy people out there that have gone to, Georgetown and all of these other schools of foreign policy, and they've learned their craft, and they go into the State Department and the Pentagon, and there's this idea that, hey, it's about national security. Even though Ukraine's on the other side of the world, it's about national security. We can't just drop Ukraine. Now, Zelensky continued, I know this has been a minute before I got back to this, but he said, I'm not signing something, this was Sunday, that 10 generations of Ukrainians will have to repay. Mr. Zelensky said, noting that negotiations would continue, drawing on Ukraine's revenue from natural resources. He said, it might take 250 years to pay $500 billion, which he called an unrealistic aim. He's got a point, right? It is extortionate. And again, I'm not by any means necessarily siding with him. I think he should have went to the negotiating table a long time ago. I think that it's unnecessary for his people to die the way that they're dying. And for that reason, I'm against him continuing this war. But, he's got a great point. I mean, you have to ask yourself, what's the value of all this for the U.S.? Now, a lot of these mines, the lithium, the iron, I guess cobalt might be involved in this, or that might be in the Congo. But a lot of these reserves are in the eastern part of Ukraine. We mentioned this in another video where we did a small deep dive into it, in my first video. And many of these reserves are in the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass, that the Russians have already taken. So exactly what are we going to be able to get? Is there $500 billion worth involved in any kind of extraction? Do we have the infrastructure? All these different things. All these questions. In Ukraine, Zelensky is expected to visit the White House on Friday, amid reports of finalizing a mineral deal access with the Trump administration. This isn't the original one that we were talking. This isn't the one from Friday or the one from Scott Bessent. And we're going to get into the updated one right now. Now, this is from the Journal. And like we just said, Zelensky's pegged to visit the White House on Friday to sign a minerals deal. And again, we don't know how that's going to look. There's a leaked version of it out there. We're not going to get into those details tonight. We'll probably do that in a subsequent video. But the article says, quote, Zelensky says there's a U.S. mineral deal, but many details are unresolved. And he said as much between the release of this article Wednesday and today. He says this is a framework. It's not really a deal. And it's really just a document. It's vague. It's very general. There's no kind of deal that you work out between two countries that would look like the bullet points in this particular deal. Zelensky said he had reached a deal with the U.S. over Ukraine's mineral resources, but many details remain to be worked out before any money starts flowing. The deal between Ukraine and the U.S. includes the creation of a fund co-owned by the two countries with profits shared evenly, Zelensky said, describing it as a framework agreement between Kiev and Washington. And I think that when we look at this language, the framework agreement, it's largely cosmetic, right? It's topical. It's meant to give both parties, or at least Trump and the administration, a political win. Whether it's sustainable in the long term, whether a lot of these details related to this deal, this draft, or whether a lot of those details are presented to us in detail later, remains in question. I'm skeptical. I'm definitely not optimistic about that. The exact arrangement between the two countries, including exactly how the fund would be set up and any potential security guarantees for Ukraine, will need to be worked out in the future agreements. Again, a framework. So a lot of this hype is basically about a draft agreement, right? And the media is portraying it as a capitulation by Trump, right, to the Russians, or a sellout to the Ukrainians. And it's a draft agreement, and again, we're probably not going to get many of the details that would that would better inform us in our analysis until later on. We might not even hear about it. This deal is part of our broader arrangement with the United States, said Zelensky. This deal can be part of future security guarantees. Keyword security guarantees. You're going to keep coming back to that, because this thing has the security guarantee situation has to be hammered out, and the Russians are not going to start negotiations if the idea of European troops is on the table in Ukraine. If European troops, or American-backed European troops, or this open spigot of war material is still flowing into Ukraine, I don't think that a ceasefire or the opening of negotiations is on the table, honestly, based on what they've said. And let's see here. The exact arrangement between the two countries, including exactly how the phone would be set up, we went over that. Zelensky said he had been invited to the U.S. to meet with President Trump this week, but he wasn't sure if he would go. Any details of this visit are still being worked out. Now, it's Thursday, and apparently and allegedly all the details have been worked out. He's supposed to be coming tomorrow. And I think it's interesting looking at the language here, because Zelensky says he's been invited to the U.S. to meet with the president. Separately, Trump told reporters in the Oval Office Tuesday that he heard, and this is kind of insulting, he heard Zelensky was visiting on Friday, and certainly it's okay with me, is what he said, if he'd like to. And this was cited by The Hill and other outlets. Zelensky said he was invited. Trump says, I heard he was coming. What does that tell you about this relationship and how volatile it is, right? What does this lead to? What's the end game for this? I mean, can we take any of this stuff seriously? Is this a James Baker-esque or a Kissinger type deal that's being worked out? And look, many of you may not like either one of those characters I just mentioned, but this was the character, the nature of those negotiators versus what we're seeing right here. This is a circus. And, Trump went on to say in that press conference, without the United States and its money and its military equipment, this war would have been over in a very short period of time. I hear Zelensky is coming Friday. This was the exact quote. It's okay with me. It could be $1 trillion deal, which it wouldn't be. In anyone's imagination, it wouldn't be. It could be whatever. I think the whatever is the right word for it. Biden was throwing around money like it's cotton candy. Whatever. At some point, he's going to have to leave the Biden administration alone, And then we go back to the Journal article. Zelensky said, quote, this visit before Putin is a very good signal. Zelensky is very insecure. he doesn't like Putin. Putin's a statesman. Zelensky's walking around in a green sweatshirt. Shows you the difference. Still, he emphasized that the future of the mineral rights deal would depend on his broader conversations with Trump and the president's commitment to helping Ukraine. And he's just being, again, he's keeping his options open. Even in the document that you read that highlights many of the details in this alleged proposal, it's very broad, right? Nothing is hammered out. There are no details. There's no one managed this joint fund. There's the peacekeepers situation and the security situation is just left broad. You know, so there's a lot of space for both sides to work in. And so, again, what can you read from any of this? Except that Zelensky's going to come and, there might be an upset. He might embarrass Trump. Trump might embarrass him. We'll be looking forward to it. I'll do another episode once the meeting happens. But Zelensky said he would have several questions for Trump whenever they met, including whether the U.S. would cut off aid to Ukraine, which they won't, and if so, whether Ukraine would be able to buy weapons from the U.S. He would, and that's something that I'm sure Trump would be completely okay with. Again, we think about this idea of aid to Ukraine. I think that Trump is not against aid to Ukraine, as proven with the Javelin situation. I think it's just the nature of how the aid is presented to the American people. It can't be presented in the same way that invading Iraq was, the WMD thing. He's going to try to spin it, any kind of aid, as a benefit to us, like this mineral deal. Zelensky said the current memorandum of understanding was an improvement on the original one because it didn't ask Ukraine to pay back aid that the U.S. had already sent. The exact economic arrangement of the co-owned fund will need to be determined in future agreements. So this is going to, I said it earlier, in most of these agreements, they're going to take probably months, and in a normal administration, years. This is not a normal administration. Trump only has 4 years. Apparently, we don't know what could happen later on, but he has 4 years, and he's looking to resolve this as quickly as he can. Now, the shortcuts he's going to take could impact the longevity and the effectiveness of any deal that's reached, whether it's minerals, a ceasefire, a long-term peace. All of that's going to be affected by the fact that Trump has 4 years, really 2 because midterms are coming up. So this political mandate that he has because of the election is going to run out. He only has a limited amount of time to do anything. And I think that's what he's probably focused on more so than anything. It's just getting something done so that he can put his name on it and sell it to the American people. Right. Now, on Wednesday, Zelensky said the Mineral Rights Framework Agreement does include a mention of security guarantees for Ukraine, though he didn't provide further details. And I've read it, and it's very vague. Vague enough not to deny them security guarantees, right? Just because it's vague doesn't mean that the commitment isn't there. If we have, again, firms and investors that have their equipment and their personnel in Ukraine extracting these minerals, you're going to have some kind of security guarantee over there. It's not going to just be the Europeans guaranteeing your businesses and investors and what they're investing in. Now, since Trump began his broadside, the article continues, broadsides against Zelensky this month, European countries have started planning for how they could support Ukraine in the U.S. were aid to be cut. Zelensky said 8 Northern European and Baltic countries, of course, the Baltic countries, the ones that are the most insecure, are now discussing sending military contingents, I don't know where they're going to get those from, to help guarantee Ukraine's security during a ceasefire. Now, what I want to do here is I want to round this off with a few statements from Lavrov, Sergei Lavrov, and he's the foreign minister in Russia. Let me make sure I have that right. Yep, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Russia. I should, know that off the top of my head. Sometimes I just don't want to, make mistakes here. But he made a couple of comments related to some of the things we've been discussing. And he says, quote, Russia is not considering any options for the deployment of European peacekeepers in Ukraine, which again, this is like the crux of this mineral deal. This rare earth deal that Trump is talking about for the Europeans and for many within Trump's administration who are neocons. Most people won't want to admit it. This is centered on security. This is centered on the idea of doing a Yugoslav situation and putting peacekeepers in Ukraine, European peacekeepers that are hostile to the Russians. Now, if they were upset, if they were averse to the idea of putting NATO troops on Ukrainian territory, what would change their mind just because you call them European peacekeepers with guns, right? To manage some kind of demilitarized zone like, North Korea and South Korea. Why would the Russians back off of this? I don't know if they will, right? I don't know. But Lavrov says Russia is not considering any options for the deployment of European peacekeepers in Ukraine. No one has asked Moscow about this. There will be no cessation of hostilities along the contact line. We have a constitution. You can't go for an agreement that is aimed at achieving one single goal, to pump Ukraine with weapons again. Which is what would effectively happen if you were going to be putting peacekeepers in Ukraine. If you were going to be doing this Israeli option, the foreign policy, this fellow in foreign policy was talking about, it's like, think about Israel. You're pressing, military aid and war material into the country, right? That's the antithesis of no NATO. It's exactly what the Russians were saying before. No NATO involvement. We don't want NATO's missiles on our border. We don't want the ATACMS missiles or Storm Shadow missiles on the border of Ukraine, which is implied in any kind of peacekeeping operations. It's like what would be allowed. So it makes sense for the Russians to say, well, if we don't want NATO on our borders, why would we want security guarantees, which is even broader, right, than a NATO guarantee? And like we just said, you can't go for an agreement that is aimed at achieving one single goal, to pump Ukraine with weapons again. Some people say there were ideas, let's leave the line of contact. This is Russian, this is Ukrainian. First of all, there will be no such thing. We have a constitution based on the will of the people. That constitution basically says that Russia owns those oblasts, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk, up to their administrative borders. And the Russians haven't even gotten there yet. So this is, again, another sticky spot that Trump is going to have to work around. Right? Now, just some last notes here. We have this from the New York Times. This is again about the recent agreement. And it says, quote, the agreement is seen as opening the door to possible continued backing from the United States under the Trump administration, either as aid for the war effort or as enforcement of any ceasefire. Officials in the United States and Ukraine said on Tuesday that a version has been accepted by both sides. This rare earth deal, all right, we're getting closing statements. This is like a guarantee for us to stay over there. And, New York Times, many other people have said this. This is like a guarantee for us to have to stay involved in Ukraine, similar to Iraq. Or, even if you think about Syria, we have troops over in Syria because they're guarding oil fields over there. Right? And, long ago there was a case made for Afghanistan and rare earths in Afghanistan for us to still be over there. And it proved to be largely, it wasn't as consequential as many thought. And we don't even know if the Ukrainian government is going to accept any of this stuff. I don't even think that Zelensky is going to be running this by any of them and going through the formal approval process for these kinds of negotiated treaties with the Ukrainian government. We'll see. Also from the New York Times, says, quote, earlier on Wednesday, Ukraine's prime minister Den Shamal spoke about the new phrase about security guarantees, and the term suggested that the United States had not acceded to their quest for its inclusion. Mr. Shamal said that neither Mr. Zelensky nor other officials in the Ukrainian government would sign the deal if the phrase were omitted, calling it an integral element to the agreement of minerals. These people want the security guarantees, right? That's not a starting point for the Russians, right? And I don't know, is this something that would create enough friction within Ukraine's society and within the government to depose of Zelensky? I don't know. But this is a key issue. And if it's vague, again, I would argue that this is implied in any deal where the U.S. is involved with extracting minerals or resources from Ukraine. It's kind of implied that there's going to be some kind of security contingency, whether it's private security or formal, European security backed by the U.S. Something like that's going to be there. And as far as I can see, that's like not an option for the Russians. So we'll see. There's just some notes that I have here. As for Europe's newly touted, the Europeans have now pushed for their own deal for rare earth material in Ukraine. Ukrainians have pushed their own proposal to the European Union for extraction of their rare earths. And we all know that the Europeans don't have that infrastructure. But as for Europe's newly touted rival rare earths deal being discussed with Ukrainian leadership, some observers might see this as yet another attempt of Washington's European allies to sabotage Trump's maneuvering towards peace. I don't know that he's maneuvering towards peace. We'll have to see. Critics have said Trump is essentially forcing Ukraine to give up its future economic sovereignty, which is true. And it's sad. And again, I think that this war, much of the responsibility is on Ukraine. If you listen to the show long enough, you'll understand why I believe that. Many of you will probably say that it's Russian propaganda, much of my reasons, but it doesn't really matter. It is what it is. These people, they're dying for no reason, and they could be very lucrative just working with the Russians. They could be working with us too, right? But there's a lot of Cold War insecurity that still exists, and it's unfortunate. And perhaps this is my final note on this, and then we'll close off. Perhaps this statement below gives a taste of why Europeans want the U.S. central to any security guarantees or potential negotiations regarding Ukraine's accession to the EU, security guarantees, and the accession to the EU is a topic unto itself, right? And this is again from Foreign Policy. This is Adam Tooze from that same interview that we were talking about earlier. And again, I don't think that historically, based off of this statement, Europe has been too enthusiastic about, wrapping Ukraine into their military infrastructure like NATO or the EU. But if they are going to do it, it seems that they're adamant that the U.S. back them in any capacity that they do it. Probably for this reason. That's why European states led by Germany, most prominently until 2022, vigorously resisted any suggestion that Ukraine would ever become a full EU member. It's too big, it's too agrarian, it's too poor, it's too obviously problematic from a geopolitical point of view, and its politics are certainly too fragile. Its democratic credentials were too fragile in the Yanukovych regime that was felled by the great demonstrations in 2013. It was a clean election by any standards, but everyone agreed that it was as good as Ukraine was going to produce, as it was a pro-Russian government that was elected there. So Ukraine looked profoundly unappetizing to the EU. So we'll see what happens. We're going to be covering the visit from Zelensky very soon. As soon as we get the details of that, that's happening tomorrow. And we'll join you again very soon. I want to thank you again for joining us tonight on Global Realignment. I want to remind you to subscribe and like the video and give me a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me about how I can improve. You all have a good night.